Thank you, Jennifer, and thanks again, Ashley, for such a great event. Okay, I wanted to start with this. This is a patent filed by Jonathan Cohen on behalf of Amazon in 2016 for what's called the haptic feedback system. The system was designed to be deployed within Amazon's fulfillment centers and primarily consists of three components. First is an ultrasonic wristband worn by the fulfillment associates. Second, an ultrasonic transducer arranged in XY coordinates across the fulfillment center's shelving. And third, a central processor called the management module that records the interactions between the wrist and the shelf and provides feedback to the worker's wrist through a language of ultrasonic pulses. I wanted to begin with the haptic feedback system because specifically I think it was designed in order to perform two distinctly different tasks. Tasks that I think comport to two distinctly different versions of logistics and their relationship to the economies of fulfillment. The first task is perhaps exactly the one that you might imagine. That is, the system monitors the location of an associate within the fulfillment center and the location of the associate's wrist within the XY plane of the shelf so that it might more efficiently organize the associate's bodily movements. This performance, I think, can be understood as a technologically sophisticated and perhaps slightly dystopic, but basically conventional deployment of a modern logistical regime, oriented towards using technology to better manage the circulation of matter, including bodies, through time and space. But the feedback implied by the system not only consisted of the communication network established between the worker's wrists and the management module, but an altogether different network of feedback occurring between the worker's wrist and their own psychological interior. In recording individual workers' gestures over time and building behavioral profiles of each individual associate, the management module was later described by Amazon engineers in 2016 as being capable of forecasting the emerging moods of workers by modeling cognitive states such as distraction, fatigue, excitement, ennui, via the gestures of the associate. I think Amazon's haptic feedback system stands in for a broader shift in logistical thinking that begins with the collapse of the dot-com bubble in 2002. This shift, largely pioneered by two corporations, Amazon and Google, that had profited primarily from two older logistical regimes. For Amazon, this is the industrial logistics of moving matter through time and space, and for Google, this was the post-industrial logistics of information storage and retrieval. But as the internet economy collapsed, these two entities suddenly began to reorient their economic practices more fundamentally around the user and more specifically around human behavior, construed as information to be recirculated within behavioral futures marketplaces. These are not merely new technologies, I think, but a fundamental reconstruing of subjectivity itself, one that in many ways hinges upon a changing relationship between behavior and fulfillment. Prior to 2003, the recycling of such behaviors largely centered upon those specific behaviors that could be reinvested so as to improve a user's experience. So an example of this that we might know would be something like Amazon's frequently bought together function, in which others' behaviors are recycled into our own experiences in order to increase the likelihood of our fulfillment. But any user interaction inevitably produces more information than is required for such service improvements. And it's these forms of behavioral surplus and their ability to feed new means of production around which economist Shoshana Zuboff has posited the notion of a surveillance capitalism. So here, the kind of behavioral waste is recycled into a parallel economy, one that produces a revenue stream which is sort of outside the service in which the behaviors were originally captured. Importantly, this means that if at one time our captured behaviors resulted in our fulfillment, now our behaviors primarily fulfill someone else. Zuboff says, under this new regime, the precise moment in which our needs are met is also the precise moment in which our lives are plundered for behavioral data. The result is a perverse amalgam of empowerment inextricably layered with diminishment. Or put simply, our behaviors are now the means to others' ends. Now, in a very peculiar way, this economy of non-cyclical fulfillment has hinged upon what I think of as a new phrenology of the wrist as one of its primary preoccupations. The wrist is perhaps the part of the body responsible for the largest volume of behavioral surplus. So for example, you might write an email. That email contains a few hundred characters, but in the process of writing that email, your wrist is logging thousands of individual coordinate points. So over the last decade, there's been an exhaustive body of research interested in the wrist in general and gestures specifically as an informational resource for the prediction of cognition and feeling. Amazon's haptic feedback system is just one in a collection of patents filed by Amazon, Google, and others over the last decade that construe the wrist as an extension of the mind and the capturing of the data produced by the wrist as reliable predictors of behavioral futures. We know this maybe most acutely through the proliferation of wrist-worn smart devices, which have emerged over the last decade. Oh, sorry, this was supposed to go automatically. Several devices. Or perhaps what DARPA has called next-generation biometric capabilities, which attempt to identify the cognitive fingerprints of targets of state violence through their specific gestural signatures. Or perhaps less visibly through processes described by Google's 2005 patent, which processes the wrist gestures of users into predictive models of their attention in order to establish the economic values of advertisements within the two-dimensional real estate of screen space. We can see the role that our wrists play in Zuboff's notion of simultaneous empowerment and fulfillment, or diminishment, sorry, in something like Amazon's migrating Buy It Now button, which over the last, 6 years since its introduction in 2013 has moved 15 times between 10 and 100 pixels each time. On one hand, these subtle relocations are caused by hundreds of thousands of captured gestures produced by all of us here, essentially design drawings, incrementally moving the button closer to what's called the prime pixel, a kind of pixel holy grail within screen space that represents the closest pixel to the average user at any given moment. But it's also an instrument for feedback, a series of probes intent on testing the plasticity with which we interact with Amazon's interface. It's both defined by our gestures as predictors of behavioral futures and also intent on altering those futures through subtle forms of behavioral modification. Our gestures move the button, and in turn, the button moves us. Now, one of the strangest aspects of this emerging phrenology of the wrist is that it begins here with a phenomenon in fluid physics known as coiling instability. This is essentially when a stream of viscous fluid hits a surface and produces a very small amount of compressive resistance that reverberates up the stream and like a column buckles at the bottom, resulting in these small irregular coils. In 1994, the fluid physicist and amateur action painter Richard Taylor, here depicted on the right with a painting device of his own invention, noted that in much of the work of mid-century action painting, and in particular the work of Jackson Pollock, there was a distinct absence of any coiling instability. This was a quality that Taylor struggled to achieve within his own creative work. So Taylor proposed that one of the really remarkable talents possessed by Pollock was the ability to watch the paint as it fell, to discern the approach of coiling instability in the paint, and to produce a series of very small gestures, primarily with his wrist, in order to accelerate the paint and pull it out of these states of instability. Now, importantly, and for a variety of reasons, Pollock is, by quite a considerable degree, the most frequently forged mid-century artist. So Taylor, along with a group of physicists at New South Wales, in collaboration with IBM's Watson Research Center, hypothesized that within these micro-gestures performed by Pollock in order to avoid coiling instability, there was a kind of biometrics of Pollock's body, specifically the fulcrum of his wrist and the datum of his chest height. And that if those biometrics could be modeled, one could use them in order to authenticate his work. So here, several years later, is a kind of reconstruction of the viscosities of 5 Pollock blacks and their points of coiling instability at various speeds and time. Here again, a correlation between speed and time, along with a catalog of gestures performed by Pollock in order to pull paint out of its coiling instability. What I find important here is the idea that Taylor, himself an amateur painter working in the gestural tradition, largely embraces a framing of the gesture which is not foreign to art historical or architectural understandings of the term. That being essentially that the gesture is an extension of the subjectivity of the artist into external matter, and for Taylor and IBM, the idea that this extension produces feedback that can be read against the grain in order to rediscover the body of the artist, or perhaps the body of a forger. Now, this research failed, quite catastrophically, in 2007, largely because the various viscosities of paint, air temperature, humidity, and the contortions of Pollock's own body proved too complex to accurately reconstruct. But the difficulties of physical matter seem significantly less intrusive digitally, so as early as 2003, while the internet bubble was collapsing, this notion of digital browsing as an analog of action painting, and one that could be reliably read backwards, is taken up by Taylor's IBM collaborators, along with a group of cybersecurity researchers at West Point University, and shortly after, companies like Amazon, Google, and today a host of niche analytics platforms such as Mouseflow, UserTrack, and ClickTail. Now, this is a kind of a preamble to a series of gesture paintings I've been working on for the last few months, produced through custom hardware and software, gesture tracking analytics platforms like MouseFlow, and a group of online collaborators. This is part of a broader research into contemporary analytics frameworks, like gesture modeling, which I think today constitute new conditions for the existence of life. These are conditions that I find frankly distressing for two reasons, both because these predictive frameworks expropriate an individual's right to their own future tense as an informational resource, but also because they rely on a kind of radical asymmetry of knowledge. So in fact, it's much less like this than it is like this. We might, for example, intuitively understand that our gestures are being tracked and transformed into authentication processes, predictive models of our emotional states, or the real-time status of our attention. But these systems are designed to be unknowable both to us and to any conventional form of governance. So the goal of this work is, I think, sort of in a hopefully a modest way to encounter these frameworks through which our lives are construed as analytical content are being redesigned, and to try to discover within them alternate ways in which we can live, both with expanded versions of ourselves and others. So the paintings begin with a web platform. This was accessed initially by Amazon Mechanical Turk workers. The platform prompts a series of gestural movements from these workers, relocating these windows across the screen. Each relocation prolongs an engagement with the platform, allowing me to harvest additional gestural information from each individual worker. But it also parcels the screen into quadrants, asks the worker to draw a figure in the space that remains, and then exports both that figure and the worker's gestures while paying them for their labor. So out of these interactions, there's both a kind of drawn figure and an array of time-stamped Cartesian coordinates that can be reassembled in order to build identity models of each of the workers. This includes the previously mentioned prime pixel, which is the closest pixel to the worker's cursor at any given moment, what's called a cursor vector, which is the direction in which the mouse is most likely to move from a static position, and a fairly reliable way of predicting right and left-handedness, as well as using a tool called MouseFlow, a simulation of the worker's eye position on the screen relative to the movements of their wrists. I'll say more about these algorithms at the end, but essentially it's through these modeling processes that wrist gestures are imagined as thresholds through which one can arrive at cognition. This gesture outsourcing is then translated into a kind of outsourced action painter with, like Richard Taylor, a homemade painting instrument. This instrument allows me to essentially array workers' figures into fields and control paint as it drips into these fields, while at the same time adjusting the speed of the device as it moves around the cursor vector arc in order to avoid coiling instability. So in the very first iterations of these works, the work was produced through a kind of feedback, like Amazon's Buy It Now button, in which the software was arranged and rearranged in order to elicit certain kinds of gestural densities from the workers, essentially designing by forecasting and surveilling the gestures of others. But what was particularly interesting to me is that within this sort of arbitrary chain of translations from software to painting, each individual worker produces a mark, and each authenticated user produces a panel, but the number of marks and the number of panels never evened out. So the images emerge out of a series of misauthentications in which an individual worker is authenticated as multiple users, or multiple workers are collapsed into a single authenticated user. The work is produced by a group, which contains both people making gestures on their computers, but also predictive models of those people. And the primary optical effect of the work, the layering of multiple fields of paint on a single panel, sorry, I looked away. The layering of multiple fields of paint on a single panel emerges through the kind of disjuncture between worker and user. So, for example, this painting was made by, I think, 21 people occupying 7 predictive identities. So, anyways, while I was working on this, it took like several months to get this process going, and hundreds of different Mechanical Turk jobs, and eventually I started to get these Google alerts about forum posts that were from Amazon workers who were sort of speculating on the nature of these jobs. So I got in touch with as many of these workers as I could, and I showed them the paintings that I was making and gave them sort of a version of this talk. And several of them were interested in like collaborating more kind of authentically on that. So over the last 3 months, I've been working with a group of 7 of these workers, several college students here in the US, there's a painter in Costa Rica, there's a retiree in England, and then there's a number of people like Turk Optic Eye that I don't know anything about except their wrists. So collectively, we're trying to work within this arbitrary image-making protocol in order to discipline our gestures as a group, controlling the way in which we aggregate and disaggregate into each other's models. This collaboration happens mostly over a Discord server, in which we look at the previous work and talk about certain ambitions for work that we might produce within the next round. These shared ambitions are then choreographed through a set of browser-based gesture specifications that coordinates the group's risk control by designing gesture speed, movement, and so forth. It also relies on like a really sort of intense devotion to like avoid fidgeting, which kind of throws the whole system into a kind of disarray. So over the last couple of months, we've been able to produce increasingly consistent gestural content and in turn, increasingly deliberate models of ourselves. We made this back in December, in which we were trying to occupy a single predictive identity and identical cursor vectors, while at the same time producing significantly more irregular fields in order to heighten the optical effect of the work. So we were kind of interested in this degree to which like a single identity with irregular marks were sort of at odds with each other. This is a work that we produced in which we were trying to sort of reveal the screen extents. So the kind of corner of the screen, or the corner of the piece, which you see in the top left-hand corner, is essentially the corner of our collective 1080p monitor space. And at the same time to expose the green underpainting layer, which is normally obscured by the thickest layers of paint by elongating our circles into near identical ovals. This is the last one we finished just last weekend, in which we were trying to basically work over two stages to reverse our cursor vectors between the first and the second stage, leading to a kind of bad symmetry which runs through the middle of the object, in which each individual person shares two predictive models with their collaborators on either side of the object. We were also interested in trying to work the kind of allographic nature of this process backwards. So Sarah Naday, one of the collaborators I've been working with, produced a specification for my own gestures, which involved identically reproducing by hand their eye tracking positions across the panel. So it's a kind of outsourced hand-eye coordination, which involves my hands and their eyes. The one we're working on at the moment, I think, is probably the last one, but it's one that we've sold, and so right now we're kind of thinking about how the system of specifications also turns into a kind of model of profit sharing, so that the object can kind of be imagined as a corporation, both for organizing our gestures, but also organizing ourselves financially. So what interests me in this work is the idea that I think these ways of reconstituting life through analytics are largely oriented towards a politics of relentless individuation and ultimately isolation. A general principle of analytical technologies is that the more we can be differentiated from one another, the more valuable our behaviors become. So I'm interested in this idea that we could work these technologies in the other direction, essentially towards a kind of collective of people, in this case, organized around a mutual empathy for each other's risks. Lastly, I wanted to kind of end with this, which is a software, drawing software that's maybe a kind of another extension of this research. This was commissioned by the CCA, and this is sort of the very, very first working version of it that just appeared like a couple weeks ago. I think it'll be released in the beginning of summer, and hopefully it'll look different than this somehow. So essentially, this software works through these attention modeling algorithms that I mentioned previously. So basically, you open your browser, you move your mouse, and marks are produced by harvesting your gesture information in order to simulate your eye position on the screen in near real time. Right now, it allows you to select between 4 different algorithms for correlating gestures to cognition, or you can also run multiple algorithms simultaneously and identify the differences between them. So I think of it sort of like a modeling software in which like you're the thing that's being modeled. And it's a kind of a disconcerting experience because you sort of draw and you can tell that what you're doing is causing something to happen, but it's a nonlinear relationship. And so it's sort of, I described it like a Ouija board. It's kind of like, it's kind of an awkward experience, I guess. But the idea is that eventually, with a certain amount of practice, you can deduce certain relationships between your gestures and the graphic content they produce. So this is me self-training for like 30 minutes to draw a smiley face. It's like actually too hard right now. That's one of the problems. But importantly, it's impossible to get any kind of graphic content out of the browser. So the page reloads periodically, and every time it reloads, the content dies. but your gestures are exportable, describable, and shareable as specifications for future marks made by future participants. So one always produces within the software through the gestures of others, either by prescribing the gestures of future actors or by reenacting the gestures of previous participants. And maybe, like the paintings a little bit, offers a way to imagine a kind of alternative politics of empathy built through these technologies of relentless isolation. So, thanks.